Anything that we need to take up before we proceed? All right, very well. Let's bring jurors, please. All right, final arguments for the defense. I believe we'll begin with Ms. D.
Thank you, Ron. The law never demands death. That's what lies at the core of issue number 4. Even if a jury finds that the aggravating circumstances are not outweighed by the mitigating circumstances, that the aggravating circumstances weigh more, the jury is still called upon to go that extra step and to determine whether or not those aggravating circumstances, when looked at in light of the mitigating circumstances, are sufficiently substantial to call for the imposition of the death penalty. In other words, there is always a role for the mitigating circumstances, and there is always room for the mitigating circumstances to urge mercy in a case. Before going any further, I would like to say again that these are not excuses for the murder of Melissa Huggins-Jones. Travion Smith is guilty of first-degree murder. Travion Smith is responsible for first-degree murder. Travion Smith will be sentenced for first-degree murder. Travion Smith is going to die in prison. He will never leave prison on his own volition. The only question that is left to decide is whether or not God will determine the time and manner of his death, or whether that determination will be made by the state of North Carolina. In jury selection, we talked about mitigating circumstances. And the instructions that you're about to get are going to have a long definition of mitigating circumstances, along with the other legal principles that you'll be called upon to apply to all the evidence you have heard now in both phases of this trial in determining what the appropriate sentence is. And what those instructions say, and forgive me because I have to read them, but what they say is a mitigating circumstance is a fact or group of facts which do not constitute a justification or an excuse for the killing or reduce it to a lesser degree of crime than first-degree murder, but which may be considered as extenuating or reducing the moral culpability of the killing or make it less deserving of extreme punishment than other first-degree murders. Our law identifies several mitigating circumstances, including the young age of the defendant, which you'll be instructed about. However, in considering issue 2, this is going back to the language of the instruction, It would be your duty to consider as a mitigating circumstance any aspect of the defendant's character or record and any of the circumstances of this murder that the defendant contends is a basis for a sentence less than death, and any other mitigating circumstances arising from the evidence that you deem to have mitigating value. Again, the law requires that capital punishment be reserved for the narrow category of defendants who commit the most serious crimes and whose extreme culpability make them most deserving of execution. Travion Smith is simply not one of those defendants. He was 20 years old at the time of the murder, but you've heard considerable evidence about his immaturity. The teachers and the counselors who he worked with through the years universally described him as immature and young for his age. And the state's rebuttal evidence, they've made a lot of comments about how you haven't heard anything about Travion Smith since 2009, but you did hear about Travion Smith since 2009 throughout the state's 4 witnesses in rebuttal to the sentencing evidence in this case. And those records and that evidence underscore his immaturity. Deciding that you think it's unfair for the whole pod to go on lockdown because the person who turned off the TV won't fess up, and you therefore refuse to go to your cell, and after you get pepper sprayed, keep insisting that you were just trying to have a peaceful protest. A peaceful protest in the jail over the TV, that is childish. That is childish behavior. And similarly, acting smart with the same sergeant who pepper sprayed you in the incident over the TV, saying, "Bye, bae." Well, that's childish. Childish behavior that invites negative consequences is the definition of immaturity. So yes, he is old enough to get the death penalty. But are you convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he is mature enough to understand the nature and consequences of his actions in a way that an adult would? Are you convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he is capable, as an adult would be, of controlling the impulsive behavior that you heard about throughout the witnesses that you heard in this phase of the trial? Ms. Chiquita said a number of things about perhaps most of the 8th graders have a clinical diagnosis that includes ADHD. I submit to you that as she asked you to do, consider your common sense and your life experience in determining whether or not you think most of the 8th graders have that clinical diagnosis, and whether or not most of the 8th graders have their first inpatient hospitalization when they were 6. I'd like you to, as she asked you to do, use your common sense about thinking back about how many of the parents you knew would put alcohol in their children's bottles to get them to sleep. And just while I'm on this, throughout this whole process, what's critical is that you remember the evidence the best that you can and not rely on what any of the lawyers say. So for instance, if you remember Dr. Evidence also testifying about Zyprexa, which is an antipsychotic, that he was diagnosed through those years, then that's your correct memory. And you should remember the best you can what all of these witnesses had to say. So for instance, if you remember the probation officer, Mr. Shellhorn, also describing Travion Smith as gullible, then you can remember that. And you don't have to rely on just the people who saw him during the school setting and in the programs that he went to before 2009. Part of the answer to why Travion was and is as immature as he is comes through looking at his early life. He was born into an undoubtedly terrible situation. His mother didn't want him. His brother Corey testified about knowing always that she didn't want any of her 4 boys. And she would go years between visits with her sons, and she did not provide basic care for Travion as a baby. Basic care is feeding your child, having food in the home, having formula in the home, changing diapers, putting up basic safety gates in the house, not heating the home with an open oven when you have a toddler and a baby milling about that space in the common area. So Antoinette Smith didn't provide that basic care when he was a baby, and neither did Michael Clark. Remember, Michael Clark was in prison. So who did provide that care? Well, Laura Cannon, in part, and maybe some other neighbors. We know that Laura Cannon loved him. Everyone says she loved him. There are studio pictures of him when he's the age he would have been with her, suggesting she cared enough about him to order the pictures. There's a picture when he was slightly older, but Miss Janes didn't recognize it because she didn't know him then. Said that she didn't know who that was and she couldn't identify that photo. But we know that those two are evidence of the fact that Laura Cannon did love him and did care. So Antoinette Smith gave her baby to her neighbor. And Wake County DSS let that placement stand, never making any inquiry into how she came to be identified in the record as Michael Clark's sister when she had initially been identified as Antoinette's neighbor. And similarly not making any inquiry into the allegation, the comment that Claudia White made in her last CPS report about the fact that she was also concerned about Laura Cannon tearing up Pico's butt when his mother was not there to protect him. And Claudia Janes, this is a long time ago, and maybe she doesn't remember that. What she remembers is that Laura Cannon cared about these children. But we know that she made that report at the time because it's in the record. That's not a back door. That's just a fact that sometimes a record at the time of something is a better document as to what happened at someone's memory 20 years later, or what all their concerns were 20 years ago. But DSS never made any inquiry into that part of the complaint that related back to Laura Cannon, the type of discipline that Laura Cannon was giving to Pico. And again, let's think about how young he was. So the time where Claudia White and Laura Cannon are both still living on Hare Snipe Court was the year and a half. Travion was at most a year and a half old at the end of that time. That is a young child to be having your butt torn up. DSS never did a kinship placement assessment of Laura Cannon's home. And we know there was other domestic violence in that home because she died as a result of the domestic violence in her home committed on her by her husband. But regardless of what the actual circumstances were in that home, we know that by the time Travion was 5, those circumstances were no longer critical in his life because she had been murdered by that time. This is all happening to Travion as he is starting kindergarten and already exhibiting such extreme emotional and behavioral problems that he always had to be taught in a self-contained special education classroom. So by 5, we know for sure he's with Dad, although it's a little bit unclear exactly who he's with from September, I want to say, 1994, when we know both of the children are out of Antoinette's custody, and the time where Miss Cannon has been murdered, so we know he's with his dad. It's a little bit unclear who he's with during that time. But by 6, according to Anne Marie Evans, he's having his first inpatient psychiatric hospitalization. Again, that's not the kind of problems paying attention that might impact a larger percentage of children. There's no doubt that parenting Travion was challenging. But there's also no doubt that he responded well to the structured environments that you heard about in the testimony throughout the second phase of this trial. And sadly, those placements and services were sometimes short-lived for a variety of reasons, because the agencies changed, or because there was turnover in employment, or because somebody was unhappy with the services. But one person who wasn't making any of those decisions at that time was Travion Smith. And he did do well in a lot of those programs, and he didn't necessarily stay in the places where he was doing well. In Ms. Chiquita's PowerPoint, she had a reference to Ms. Myers and to the fact that Ms. Myers said that the structure at home is never exactly like the classroom. No, certainly not. Certainly not exactly like a contained special ed classroom with like 5 kids in it. No. There's not a structured environment like that at home. But there are ways that those programs are set up to attempt to have dialogue with the parents and an attempt to help to work with the parents to have some sort of continuity between the school day and home and have some sort of structure. And I hope you'll remember Ms. Meyer saying that as part of that system, she had paperwork that went home every day for the parents to complete and to give feedback, so that she could then have a loop with the kids and be able to talk to them about their progress at home and what was going on with them, and there wouldn't be a total disconnect between those two parts of the day. And because she never got any paperwork back on Travion, she had to have another teacher in the school make up fake home reports so that she would have something to talk to Travion about to try and give him that encouragement about working on his goals throughout the day. Jennifer Myers also told you that when she told Michael Clark how well Travion was doing, because he did so much better from the middle of that year forward, only half a year, but he did a lot better. He passed his IEPs, he was really doing well in class, and so she wanted to engage Michael Clark around that and talk about how well Travion was doing. And what she told you is that she has this strong memory of telling Michael Clark that day that he was there with the younger brothers, and his response is that she was wrong. Travion was not doing well. Travion was doing poorly. And that's the message Travion heard in front of his younger brothers and in front of whatever other students or peers were there to hear that. I'm not going to talk about all the mitigation witnesses. I trust that you heard them, and I trust that you heard the value of what they were saying. There's no real dispute about the mitigating circumstances that will be submitted to you. You each have to determine individually the weight and magnitude of each of those circumstances, but their truth is largely unchallenged. Travion was born into a terrible situation. He spent several years in an unknown situation with Laura Cannon Champion, and then with considerable emotional and behavioral problems, he went to live with Michael Clark. Travion is not similarly placed to any of his siblings. All of his other siblings were raised after their whatever period of time with Antoinette by either a parent or a grandparent who wanted to have them and who was committed to nurturing and taking care of them. Travion was bounced around until he came to live with his father who's so upset when he found out that Antoinette was pregnant that he beat her and punched her in the stomach in an effort to end the pregnancy. That is who Travion ended up being raised by. In our world, in our country, and in our justice system, we put a premium on people taking responsibility for their actions. I want to talk to you about the lessons that Travion was taught about taking responsibility. It is uncontroverted that after Laura Cannon Champion was murdered, Travion had one primary caregiver, his father. And that is who he called the morning after this murder, as the prosecution has already reminded you. Travion told the detectives that when he was interviewed. The morning after this happened, he was on the phone asking his father for advice, because it's true. Although this relationship might have at times been challenging and difficult for both of them, his father was the only person who was ever there for him with any consistency, and that is who he reached out to. And the evidence shows that neither Travion or his father reached out to the police after that phone call. What else do we know about the lessons that Travion learned from his father about taking responsibility for his actions? You heard from Christina Love about her father's reaction to learning that she had decided to testify at this trial. He was angry. He was furious with her, and you heard the words that she remembered from the phone call. And fundamentally, he was angry because he told her, nothing that has to do with me has anything to do with what's going on with Travion. And he resents any suggestion to the contrary. Finally, what did Travion learn from his father about taking responsibility when Travion learned about his son? Earl Dean Bailey testified about the day that Terrace Magruder and Antoinette Smith and Aaron Magruder showed up at her door. And she didn't need a paternity test for her to know that Aaron Magruder was her grandson. And Travion Smith didn't need a paternity test for him to know that the baby was his. But Michael Clark was furious. And you've heard that this was a back and forth with the probation officer. So this was an ongoing dispute between the father and Travion about the baby. The both of them talked to Mr. Shellhorn about that over time. Michael Clark knows something about the anger and resentment that come along with being forced to take responsibility for a child that you don't want and who you may not even be completely sure is yours. Nothing else explains the magnitude of his anger about Travion's child. The state argues that Michael Clark was actually a good father, good and caring father. And Christina Love said otherwise. She said that he was verbally and physically abusive to Travion and would taunt Travion with the fact that Travion had nowhere else to go. And rather than argue about these two opinions or suggest that perhaps the man's daughter has a little more insight into his character than Travion's parole officer, I want to talk about what we absolutely sort of know for sure. I want to talk about the dialogue or the post-release supervision. The passage in the post-release supervision report that both Ms. Shakita and Mr. Brown asked now Mr. Shellhorn to review with them. So this, if you recall, there was a surveillance officer. So this was not Mr. Shellhorn's notes. These are notes that were populated in his computer program by the surveillance officer who came out that night. And it says, defendant not at home. Remember, there was argument about the fact that when they were, not argument, but there was questions when Mr. Shellhorn was testifying about whether or not Travion had gone off and left the child that day. So this is the entry about that. A defendant not at home. Spoke with defendant's father. Stated the defendant had brought home a baby this date, stating that he was keeping it at the house for the weekend. Defendant's father pointed out the defendant is not even sure whether it is son. Well, is it defendant who's not sure, or is it Michael Clark who's not sure? But anyhow, later in the evening, male and then female friend came to house, and defendant went out to talk to them, leaving baby inside. Defendant's father went outside once to tell defendant to come in and look after a baby. No response. Went out a second time. This is what Michael Clark is telling the officer. Went out a second time and told defendant that he was going to call the baby's mother and come to pick him up, which would have prevented Travion from spending the weekend with his child as he wanted to. Defendant became irritated and disrespectful. Defendant's father called the Raleigh police. When the police arrived, they informed the father that since defendant was on house arrest, they could not force defendant to leave. Defendant's father called P.O. Shellhorn. P.O. Shellhorn stated that if defendant needed to be kicked out, then so be it. And that it did not matter if defendant was on EHA or not. Defendant left the property because the Raleigh police came and told him that his father wanted him to leave, and his father has not seen or heard from him since. So Travion hadn't gone off and left the baby. Travion's in the front yard talking to somebody. Travion was on house arrest. So if he wanted to have any contact with his child, it had to be there in his father's home. And he clearly was trying to take on that responsibility and trying to take care of the child and keep him for the weekend. Travion was proud of his child and wanted to be part of his life. Travion wanted to take responsibility for him. And this so infuriated Michael Clark that he called the police department, and Travion was forced to leave with the child. You can judge for yourselves whether or not that response seems to come from a father who is trying to be supportive of his child and handle the situations that his child has in his life at that moment. And you can judge from all the evidence what sort of lessons Travion learned about the importance of taking responsibility for his actions. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask that you hear the truth of the mitigating circumstances that we're asking you to consider today. Your family and your upbringing do matter. Beautiful, articulate, self-possessed Hannah Jones is a testament to how important it is to have a family that puts the well-being of the children before everything else. The circumstances that have been presented to you regarding Travion's background are true. And while they do not change the fact that he is responsible for and will be sentenced for first-degree murder, they do show the justice of mercy in this case. And I ask that you sentence him to a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you.
Need a few minutes to set up.
5 minutes.
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, I'll ask you to step in the deliberation room. We'll be at ease for about 5 minutes. Please don't discuss the case among yourselves. Leave your notebooks in your chairs while we set up the courtroom for the next argument. All right, outside the presence of the jury, there's one administrative matter that I need to take up with, and that is, it was reported to me that during, I believe, the state's closing argument, that there was either a recording device or a photo or a camera or something that was being pointed in the direction of the jury, and it was reported that it's the young lady on the second row in the black top with the earrings. Yes, ma'am. Could you tell me your name, please? I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. Do you have a camera or a recording device or anything that you were using during texting? Would you mind allowing one of the bailiffs just to look through your phone, make sure there were no photographs taken? Okay. If you could do... All right.
First off, I was, before he even came in, I was texting my mom, and he came in and sat down, and then that's when he,
Give him the phone.
All right. Ma'am, if you wouldn't mind just allowing the bailiff to inspect your phone for any photographs as well as any recordings that might have been making. And sir, just, you spoke a moment ago. What's your name, sir?
Stephen.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll just leave that as it is, and we'll be at ease for a few minutes. I'll hear back from the bailiffs about any information that needs to be brought to my attention.